Welcome to Transform Now, the podcast brought to you by robotic process automation pioneer SS&C Blue Prism. Digital transformation has the potential to reshape the way companies service their customers, engage their employees, and manage their operations. Whether you're looking to develop strategies, tactics, or best practices to positively impact the future of work, or you're curious to see how other companies have successfully navigated their digital transformation programs, then this podcast is for you. We're here to help you transform now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Michael Marchuk. Welcome to the Transform Now podcast. It's no surprise that many organizations are turning to the cloud for supporting their digital transformation efforts. Cloud providers have augmented their capabilities immensely in the past few years, which has led to some very interesting developments. Our guest on this episode is Rob Hirschfeld, founder and CEO of RackN. Rob has been working in the cloud space for nearly 25 years, so I suspect he'll have some interesting insights into how organizations are relying on cloud services to accelerate their digital transformations. Welcome, Rob.
Michael, thank you for having me. This is exciting. Great topic.
We're super happy to have you here. So, Rob, tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you started working in the cloud space and what changes you've seen over the past 25 years.
Have been a lot. I actually have the interesting distinction of having invented the cloud, not a commonly known thing. Dave McCrory and I had founded who's the that's known for data gravity, founded a startup in 1999 where we were the first people ever to install ESX outside of VMware. And we were using that to build what became known as a cloud. We filed some patents against the technology. Never made anything out of those patents. The danger of being too early is a lot of times worse to be too early than too late. That was something we found out in our startup journey for that. But we started doing that work because at the time I was writing software, and I'd write the software. I could estimate how long it would take to go and get the product built. But installing that software, actually getting it into people's desks and in their hands was incredibly hard. It took me as long to deploy and install the software as it took me to write it. And that always bugged me. That was the motivation for doing our first startup, where we were really trying to pull back on the operational challenges for people, what is now cloud. And one of the things that we found, and what I've seen in my career, is that I have, from that moment, always been focused on scaling the operational side of IT, right? I have a industrial engineering background, and to me, how do we scale this infrastructure? It goes on is a key part of watching this journey. And on that side of the story, it's actually been not that fast. For 25 years, things haven't changed that much behind the scenes in cloud.
So obviously, cloud can mean different things to different people. Some people see it as services that are offered by Microsoft or AWS that reduce cost or complexity in running IT systems, while others see it as an expensive way to lose control of your technology infrastructure by having these business units create a shadow IT infrastructure. So can you give us a baseline of what the cloud is and describe some of the advantages and potentially disadvantages of adopting cloud solutions?
Oh, that's a great question. And the way I see it, there's really two things that get conflated for what the cloud is. And when people talk about cloud, one of them is, to me, API-driven infrastructure. So can I have processes and controls that allow me to use software to control infrastructure? At the end of the day, that is, to me, is the most core definition of cloud. But because of the way that API-driven infrastructure has emerged in market, a lot of that came with a business model that we also call cloud, what the Amazon and Google, even what I was doing in my early days at that startup called Protier, we were in a business model where we said, let us run the infrastructure for you. That outsourced infrastructure model is also considered cloud. And most people link the two things together, but they could actually decouple them. So there's a choice that people make to give up ownership of infrastructure so they don't have to have the expertise of running that infrastructure and maintaining it and buying it and all that work. But that's a deliberate choice to follow a business model that gives up the ownership and control of that infrastructure. And you can be very successful doing the API-driven infrastructure side of it, buying your own infrastructure, hardware and servers, and running it yourself. Totally reasonable for people to do it. And I think one of the big things that we see is people assume that they're on a cloud journey and that requires them to follow the business model. What we see actually with my company RackN is we actually see people who are very successful on the API driven side of that infrastructure come back and say, wait a second, I could own my infrastructure and run it and operate it. And they realize that they can separate the two concepts.
So how does like microservices cloud that picture?
Microservices are, boy, in themselves, not a problem. And they actually help with agility from a business development perspective or a software development perspective, because you can have a smaller, what I would call blast radius of change and make it easier to change and introduce new types of infrastructure. That's really important and beneficial. But at the same time, we have seen a explosion of very small, narrowly defined services in the cloud space. So, and Amazon does this even though they're a single company, but we're seeing it across the industry where people have very point solutions to solve a problem, really a micro SaaS, if you want to think about it from that perspective. And in that, we are starting to reach a complexity tipping point where people's heads are starting to explode on the number of vendor relationships they have, or the integrations, or the security model behind it. And so I think microservices as a whole are fine, but this idea of having this very distributed ownership model is potentially a problem for people. Right back to the cloud, right? We were like, oh, I transferred ownership to all my infrastructure to Amazon, but now we're actually transferring ownership to a lot of different companies. And that becomes a challenge, especially when those companies only offer a SaaS solution and they have to run it for you. That one gets me scratching my head a little bit, because at some point you're like, oh, I really need this service, but I can only do it if I let this other person run it and transfer my data and understand my credentials. And if you start digging behind that, service is fine, but the business model behind the scenes, I think we'll keep coming back to this split between the service and the API and the business model that supports it. That I think people need to be asking some hard questions about.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you start considering the whole digital transformation journey and the efforts that these organizations are going through, how can cloud technologies, including the microservices and infrastructure as a service and that sort of thing, how can these technologies guide them to adopting better ways to connect with their customers?
I really think that last piece is critically important, the connecting with your customers part. At the end of the day, we're seeing a ton of things change really quickly. And I know in other shows, you really have drilled into GPT and AI and the implications of that. And that's critically important. And I appreciate those discussions too. At the end of the day, if you want to connect with your customers, you have to be ready to listen to your customers, which means you have to be able to take the things that you're doing and adapt to them, which means you have to have more agility inside of your system. But the problem that companies are having right now that I think actually keeps them from connecting with their customers is they're facing this increasing complexity in what they're building. So if you keep adapting and changing, but it forces you to keep adding increasing technical debt, adding more and more complexity, having more and more pieces, new silos, all these pieces, end up with a complexity problem. And one of the things that I find frustrating is a lot of technologists will pound the table and rant about complexity, but we have a tendency to think that the opposite of complexity is to simplify things. So if somebody's like, Rob's saying there's too much complexity. He wants us to all be single cloud, one vendor. And that's not what I'm saying. Opposite of complexity is not simplicity, or at least the antidote to complexity is not simplicity. The antidote to complexity is actually exercising the systems that you have. It's transparency from that perspective. And so when I look at how do you want to do a better job taking care of your customers, right? All the way back to that, what we need to be doing is making sure that the systems we build, we can run and exercise and keep going, right? The more you're using systems, the more you're able to make incremental changes to it or do adaptation to it, change out vendors behind the covers, right? What you really want to be doing is saying, all right, how do I take my systems, make sure I'm running them on a regular basis so that I now know how to make changes to it, detect problems, fix issues. If something breaks, it breaks quickly. All of those things are really core to helping cope with this complexity explosion that I hear people complaining about all over, but not really talking enough about how do I manage the complexity. Can't just, we're not going to eliminate, we're not putting those microservices back on the shelf. They're going to be part of our lexicon for a long time.
I could imagine. I suppose also keeping an idea on the focus of why you're doing it, because it's very easy, certainly within the technology space, to run after shiny objects, right? Hey, this is the brandy new thing. Let's put this into place. I'm sure we can use this somewhere. And what you're left with is a massive pile of stuff that may have some very good application, but as you mentioned, it becomes extremely complex and you may not be using it to its fullest extent.
We actually have a sort of interesting name for this at RackN. We call this urgently long-term, which is this idea that you definitely need to act, right? You can't sit around and wait, but you have to make sure that when you add things into your mix, you're doing it thinking about the whole system and investing long-term. And so sometimes that means you actually have to say, you know what, we're going to bring in a new technology, but we're going to make sure that the technology integrates in well to everything or is part of our exercise, or we fade something out to replace it, right? You need to keep that very consistent model. Otherwise, you're right. You're just chasing the fad of the day and trying to figure out, I've improved something. I've added a new chat system. Look at this. And that's not helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Let's keep on going on that one there, because the fad of the day currently is ChatGPT, and now the GPT-4 model was recently released and whatnot. And that seems to be creating all kinds of buzz everywhere in between ChatGPT and DALL-E and the other generative image creation things. There's tons of buzz on social media everywhere. LinkedIn certainly has got tons of posts with it. Do you think that these kinds of massive AI models and systems will help drive more cloud adoption just because of how they're operating?
Boy, first pass, one, I think you're totally right. This is a new generation in technology. There is no doubt for that. But I don't think that this locks in the clouds as the default. The thing that people have to realize, this is at the bottom of all of these AI models, is that they are redefining what skills mean and what competence means. And so one of the things that the cloud business model has really emphasized is this trade-off between ownership and expertise. And so if you think about ownership and expertise as, well, I don't have the expertise, so I'm going to give up ownership to the cloud so they run that system for me. All these models actually have the ability to change the cost equations for expertise. And so suddenly we talk a lot about writing expertise or coding expertise. We're looking at how operational expertise gets transformed, right? Or being able to run your own infrastructure. There's choices that are made in this that AI and these models can actually start changing how much expertise you have to do that work again. And so we actually can free up the human work to bring back ownership and control because AI is bringing in expertise for us in ways that always have been like, oh, I could never be as smart as Amazon is about running the cloud. First, you don't have to be, because Amazon runs things at a scale that no other person has to do. So they have complexity in their infrastructure and issues that frankly, very few other companies have. And if we take AI and make it where that expertise is accessible, even without a lot of AI, making operational work scalable and reusable and transformative, if that continues, then we actually have transferred the need for that expertise out of the systems, and it frees up people to look at other alternatives. And that's truly disruptive. That's where we're very worried about Google versus Microsoft on the search side. But I actually think that there's tremendous potential for people to use all that infrastructure in radically different ways than they have been before, or in ways where they were like, oh, I'd never be smart enough to write that automation or that system. Now you might be able to.
It sounds like that transfer of expertise allows the creativity to be reintroduced back into the humans, the employees that are working in your group. They know your business the best, right? They understand what you're trying to do, the objectives you're trying to go after. So taking that creativity and some of the strategic viewpoints they may have on, gosh, I wish we could do X, right? Now perhaps this gives them another alternative, doesn't it?
It does. One of the ones that we see all the time, and we do for RackN, we do a lot of bare metal infrastructure and automation for companies with global scales, running tens of thousands of servers. And they have experts who specialize in configuring that server to exactly their specifications. But I will tell you, they don't see much business value from that expertise, even though they have to maintain it.
Right.
There's very narrow cases where they do, but for the most part, they're employing people who they could take that knowledge and say, you know what, we don't want you to have to do that. Let's reallocate that time or think about how to actually make the systems better. And then AI would let you iterate through that process. That's the other side of this. You can also use the AI to go through exercising your systems and iterating through processes faster. It takes a lot of the toil out of that. So there's tremendous rebalancing of the control equations here in how people think about running and using infrastructure.
I appreciate your viewpoint on that. And the other thing you mentioned too, which I thought was very interesting, especially when you start to take a step back and you understand the players who are within this market space. You mentioned Amazon, Microsoft, Google. They all have their very large and, as you mentioned, extremely complicated back-end systems to operate their massive global scale clouds that are multi-tenant and amazing, right?
Yeah.
So there are all these tools that they're managing throughout that may not necessarily apply to the average corporation or organization who would be like to have that type of functionality.
Yep.
So when you see there's these opportunities where the ownership gets transferred out and there's some risk associated with that too. Now, I know you're a huge proponent of open source. I'd like you to talk a little bit about that too, but
yeah,
how does that whole open source concept, is there a future where the open source cloud solutions will be more mainstream, where the ownership will be then shared or distributed internally? And how does that open source concept foster the innovation within some of these cloud solutions? I know I gave you a lot of questions there, but it's a lot to put in that.
It's a real challenge because I think that right now, open source is under a lot of stress. We see this over and over again where open source projects, open source collaboration is really difficult. And one of the challenges that we see in the way Amazon has been criticized for doing this, I think it's part of the cycle that we set up around open source. You can have an open source project, but running and maintaining that open source project is hard. And a lot of times, this is one of the things that RackN has specifically gone through. And this is part of our origin story on RackN was back in the OpenStack days. We started a project called Crowbar that was designed to help operate OpenStack because it was really complex. And we were hoping to get some sharing and reuse and collaboration on the operation side. But what we found was that one person's operational struggles does not necessarily translate into a place for people to collaborate. And because you don't necessarily want to help, you can't help somebody fix their environment. Or if you do, you can't pull back whatever code changes. This is actually what we set out to change with RackN, is to make it so operational logic and automation could be shared between people for the first time ever. It's a hugely transformative thing. And it lets people actually collaborate around shared operations practices, not just shared code. But in open source, that is still really a challenge. Somebody fixing a problem for themselves, that's the nature of open source. You fix something for yourself, you share it with the community, and it benefits other people. My history has been that has been very hard to operationalize in a way that you can share the other piece of it. And as a consequence, we've seen a lot of open source projects become paid SaaS services. And there's value in that. There are people who are running the software for you. They don't pay necessarily for the software. And there's a schism here where companies are monetizing software that they didn't innovate, and the people who innovated it are having trouble monetizing it. And so I think there's actually a real challenge in the market around what type of technologies come in from an open source perspective and how the creators and maintainers of that technology end up having enough money out of the system to pay for sustaining it. And if you're using open source and you're not thinking through how does that get sustained and what is the path that the authors of that software are incented to fix your problems, because a lot of times they're not, then the whole ecosystem is going to fall apart. I've been watching that, and I think it's a little bit sad. Open source has not been as sunny a place lately in where things are going. And ChatGPT and some other of these models that are potentially pulling in that IP and then putting it back out without the licenses being clear is not moving further down that path. We're actually seeing it as more. I think we're in for bumpier roads ahead from an open source perspective.
So I want to clarify, so maybe you can talk with folks about your background in open source. Because you're not just some guy who had an open source project and transitioned it. This is It's a little bit deeper than that. So I would want to set the right context here.
I was on the board of OpenStack for 6 years. I was part of helping define the core, what OpenStack actually was as part of its core definition. I was very early in the Kubernetes community too, on the operational side, trying to get those things going. And so as one of the founding people in OpenStack and that community, helping shape and guide it, we spent a lot of time thinking through what it meant to build a community. And I think OpenStack, it's funny because I go to a lot of events and the OpenStack community is still alive and strong, even outside of OpenStack. And we haven't built that type of collaborative. I haven't seen any other community that's had that type of collaborative, open, we want to help each other type of sort of mentality. There's some that are very strong, especially around the languages. On the operations side, I haven't seen it quite as much. And there's an element where that's open source isn't required for that. But this is something I spend a lot of time thinking through is how do we help people on the operational side of the businesses create reusable, shareable places where they can collaborate and talk and work together and create a sense of shared delivery. OpenStack created that for a while. It's still there to an extent, but not with the same enthusiasm that it had. And you're right. I have a lot of experience in this space and keep looking to how do we recreate what that is. And at the same time, know that you can't do it without having something that really solves people's problems. And
there needs to be an objective on that end. Yeah. So when you see, there's been countless numbers of AI startups that have been just created out of thin air in the past 6 months that do some really amazing things. But most of these are all commercial SaaS type models that perhaps in the past might have initiated or had their origins in open source because of that community kind of generation and that feel maybe coming from a university side. And so do you see open source innovation changing because of these commercial models?
I do, although this comes back to ownership and operation. One of the things about open source that to me is necessary for open source, and maybe it's one of the reasons why OpenStack was successful, is OpenStack was about people running their own infrastructure. So there's a degree of autonomy, independence, ownership that open source enables, right? Those are tied together. And I do think that it's very difficult to take build an open source something without having the people receiving that be able to run it, operate it, have autonomy, right? That's what creates the community to an extent. Otherwise, you're just using a service. And it being open behind the scenes is transparent, but it's not going quite as far. So it's a really interesting thing. One of the other things that everybody in the community is aware of is what's going on with Terraform and HashiCorp, right? They built this amazing client out of Terraform, and now it's being pulled into all sorts of other products, but it's not clear how that transformation into the core of a platform actually, how the open source nature of that feeds into what the community is doing. Because HashiCorp's trying to maintain something as a product, but it's open, so there's no barriers or gates. And those are super hard models to try and figure out. It's possible, the same thing we're talking about expertise changing it. It could be that the ability to quickly generate certain types of software and then maintain it, AI could be transformative for that. I do think that it's important for us to have access. Actually, if I take a little bit of time, but I want to tell a story here. This is really useful. Why OpenStack? How I got so deeply into OpenStack. At the time I was doing OpenStack, I was at Dell, and the team I was on at Dell brought 10 solutions to market in a year. At Dell, that's unheard of. And of those solutions, every single one of them, the company was acquired. The company changed, went out of business, wouldn't give us access to technology we needed, installed, and everything fell apart. Like every single one of those entries fell apart because we were too beholden on the vendor on the other side of that. And when OpenStack showed up, one of the reasons we were very excited about it is that we could actually fix things ourselves. And that power was transformative in how things went. So open source from that perspective can be very important. It's like with RackN, one of the things that we did was we made the decision about 5 years ago to take a lot of the things that were locked up and proprietary in our model and open them, because that was actually the places people needed to read the code and help and collaborate and read what was going on. The things that we keep private now are things that nobody ever wanted to contribute to, the locking system for how we store data objects behind the scenes, right? That stuff is not something anybody else can easily touch. So understanding where you need visibility, where you want collaboration, tuning the systems for that is really important. And I think that's something we should be much more deliberate about in how these models work. And a lot of them, very few people have the expertise to build a new learning model, but there is absolutely no doubt that all of this is built upon open source contributions from the early days with Google and opening up different components of their learning models, sharing what those pieces are, the hardware, the operating systems. It's right. There's a tower of open source under all this stuff.
That's amazing. So I guess that's why I wanted to plumb those depths just a little bit, because I see such a thread that's been woven through these innovations that have come out, especially as we look at the whole ChatGPT and the GPT model itself and its evolution over time. So I thought I'd ask you a little more about that.
It's
so
an
as
incredibly
you
hard balance. Yeah.
Yeah. So look at this future state. What's on the horizon for organizations who are embracing cloud solutions?
I really do think we're in this complexity explosion. If companies aren't feeling like their systems are way more complex than they think they can cope with and getting nervous, then they're not paying attention to what they've actually building their businesses on top of. And the sad thing for them is there's no easy way to pull the reins back and slow that down. I actually think we're going to see companies going even deeper down this rabbit hole of complexity. And then we're going to start seeing stability, resilience, security problems, governance issues. We already see this every once in a while where there's a failure of some point solution in the internet that then drags everybody else down because they didn't realize they had a dependency chained through to this service, a DNS issue that cripples a service that you depend on that you thought was safe. But right, we've built this very complicated web of services together. And because of the way we're buying them, we really don't know how to inspect to see if those services are resilient and robust, but yet we've tied them all together. And so I do think companies are going to start understanding that this pattern needs to have a degree of management and deliberate control that we're not seeing right now. So I'm expecting over time that we're going to see a rebound back towards more control and ownership. We're seeing it actually in cost management, where I'm talking to people who are trying to fight cloud bills and realizing that it's very hard to control spend when there's no breaks in the cloud. We're looking towards how do we create more control and ownership. And I do think people are going to start coming back and saying, all right, how many different services do we have? How many places is our data spread? Or how many places are our employees working? How are we doing all the integrations? People need to be they will be starting to get more deliberate in those choices and starting to look for more convergence out of their providers so that they're not connecting together. All these microservices are going to have some. And we saw it with software bill of materials and supply chains and things like that. I think we came out of COVID with a new societal understanding of supply chain vulnerabilities. But apparently we only can learn about supply chain vulnerabilities when there's a shock or a failure. We're just in a space where those shocks and failures are going to start hitting companies more as they see it. And that,
so
I think that's trade-off.
Vendor transparency is a really important part to be able to really understand what all those building blocks are so that you understand where you potentially could have issues.
Definitely that, if you can really believe it and if you can act on it, is part of the challenge from that perspective. Give you back end, we're not a SaaS. That might be obvious based on my feeling on SaaS. We use a ton of SaaS models, so I'm not anti-SaaS. But as an operations platform, our customers are buying control as much as they're buying what the product does. I know from running our business that it's very common for somebody to change an API or a service to change or a certificate to expire somewhere, and integrations we depend on to fail. We cope with that the way I described, of exercising systems and making sure there's always a heartbeat running through things. That requires discipline and thought And I think that this pattern is only going to increase. And so we're going to have to be better about defending it.
Yep, that makes sense. So switching gears on you, I'm sure you keep up with the industry in a various number of ways, but are there any books that you have been reading lately that you think that perhaps this would be something you'd recommend?
Oh boy. We actually started a book club recently. One of the ones is very interesting called Data Cartels, talking about how access to data and the oligopolies behind it are there. I always would recommend like the Phoenix, there's a new book in the Phoenix Project series called Investments Unlimited that talks about some of these process concerns and governance and compliance and making all that stuff work. If you haven't read that series of books, they're excellent. They're narrative style, so they're very light reading, but there is a brand new one out called Investments Unlimited. Highly recommend that one too.
Great. I appreciate it. Rob, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights were very helpful, and the historical perspective of it really helps put things into context for both now as well as companies are looking to plan for their future. So I really appreciate the way you provide some of that kind of insight and the context that you did. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to Transform Now. For more insightful discussions on digital transformation and more, check out our podcast channel where you'll find all of our previous episodes. And to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player. And if you like what you've heard, please leave us a review. For more information about digital transformation and the future of work, check out blueprism.com to learn how SS&C Blue Prism's digital workforce is enabling enterprise transformation now.